town, and it is between 1901 and 1914, and we are in the Edwardian era, and this era was obviously named after King Edward, as all eras seem to be named after the king they are in. So this era was quite a short one compared to the Victorian era, as he didn't last too long on his reign. But during this period, it was portrayed as a romantic golden age of long summer afternoons and garden parties basking in the sun that never sets on the British Empire, as kind of romanticized after the Great War, which happens at the end of his era. So they look back at it as a fond and prosperous time, which it was. It was seen as a sort of a period of pleasure and plenty between the great achievements that happened in the Victorian age and the catastrophe of the Great War. So it had all the benefits of the technologies and the industry, but didn't have had the looming impending war that people didn't think was going to come. It was a time of peace and prosper growth rate, and manufacturing output and GDP was kind of started to fall behind countries like the US and Germany, but there was no severe Great Depressions or anything during this time. It was kind of a stable situation, which is much better than the last so many eras that we've been through with this town. It's still leading the way in world trade and finance and shipping, with London being the financial centre of the world as well. And the working class are beginning to protest politically and want to have a greater voice as well, which is a lot on in this type of era. People, different classes and women and things are starting to raise their voices and want to be heard and listened to get things changed. And the Industrial Revolution created a lot of new technologies which changed how people lived as well. So because we were coming out of the Victorian era where they were all invented or started to be invented, so that has been able to increase the productivity of the factories and things that were set up in the Victorian times, and gender roles shifted as well, as women could use these new technologies, upgrading their lifestyle and their career opportunities. And this means like they could go into like office jobs and new professions as well. And because it was more prosperous and there was more jobs and things going about, the mortality rates started to decline as more people had more money to spend on getting better food and better living conditions as well. So people's health and medical care was more affordable now they had more money. So things were looking a bit better for everyone. In women in general, there was increased illiteracy and schooling. The schools started to bring in having girls in schools in the Victorian times, and then it's increased even more to the middle classes as well during the Edwardian times, and there was a wider access of information and ideas for them. This allowed them to aspire to have professional careers and get on in the workplace as well, especially as the new profession of nursing had now been introduced for women. Especially at the end of the war, they would need people like Florence Nightingale and stuff to help them with the stuff, which is a bit earlier, but people like that. And there was more demand for people to go into teaching as well, as education was increasing. So a lot of women became teachers, and administrative tasks, things like the typewriter, the phone and filing systems had been invented. So there were roles like that. Obviously they were still not very equal compared to the men at the time, but it was a very small step in a direction. And the women's suffrage movement grew even more during this time period, especially as a more liberal party came into the government, but they still refused them to vote. It wasn't until much later and after the war that things would really improve on that front, and they tried to call for a more political voice and set up 2 of the unions as well for women, and they had a political one and a women's suffrage society as well, so people could band together and fight for equality. There were also large numbers of male and female domestic servants at this time as well, especially after the Victorian era. People needed their homes and kids looked after, but over these few 10 to 13 years, they would slowly decline as more and more young people were not willing to go into the profession, because obviously there were new and exciting jobs out there for them to be able to do. So the decline of domestic service was happening. At this time there was a few arts and stuff and literature and all that good stuff was about. So there was a rise in popular journalism aimed at the lower middle classes, with an emphasis on sport, crime and gossip, but about celebrities, and they were the Daily Mail and the Daily Mirror, which is still about now, and probably some of the West papers that you could probably read. In the arts scene, we started to come across the French style of Art Nouveau, and we'll see a bit more of that in the next century, as it wasn't too prominent at this time. It was kind of more in the later stages of English architecture. And we also had painters like Vincent van Gogh, Monet and Matisse, and the post-impressionism movement, and they had an exhibition over in London here in 1912, and this would obviously come to the more impressionist stuff during the war to try and departmentalize what the soldiers were actually seeing and stuff. We also had some big literary figures at this time as well. So we have books from E.M. Forster, Rudyard Kipling, James Joyce, D.H. Lawrence, Beatrix Potter, H.G. Wells and P.G. Wodehouse, which are all on most of those are on the classics list now in the Penguin section. So they are all written at this time. And on the architectural front, we had a kind of 3 styles. We had the remnants of the Edwardian Baroque, which was kind of appearing at the end of the Victorian era as well. It's kind of harping back to the French 18th century style, and this kind of used for more public buildings like the Dock building in Liverpool and a few places like that, and kind of goes off the same architecture style as St Paul's, as it was built by the same person, but obviously that was built a little bit earlier, but it's all trying to use that same white stone and making it look as though it's very fancy and lots of pillars and stuff like that. The houses, kind of more normal people houses, were kind of more semi-detached houses, and there was obviously some that were terraced houses as well, and big townhouse versions of the same style. But they normally had a big bay window at the front, for one for each sort of house part, and they would have very large windows at the front to let in a lot of light as well. The doorway was normally sat back in an archway, or it would have some spandrels over it just to add extra architectural detail to it, and it would normally have a little roof, a little pitch roof, or a balcony even on the top of from the second floor of the house. They were still using a lot of the red bricks, so it kind of is a small evolution from the Victorian Gothic style. They're still building out the same materials, and you could probably mistake some of the Edwardian houses for Victorian houses. They're a lot more pared down and not so Gothic as like with the added extra features on the houses, but they still have a similar vibe to them. They also have the exposed beamwork as well on the front, especially where you have the bay window part. They tend to like giving you a little bit of the roof, and they did sometimes use some stucco instead of red brick for the actual bay windows, just to add in a little bit of definition. But this was a bit later on in the century as well. They did actually start using a lot more glass in the builds as well, especially as the window size has now increased. So they've started using more conservatories as well for more wealthy and sort of middle class people who could afford that. So the use of glass in buildings was getting more and more popular as well. And they had still kept some of the detailing on the outside of the houses, so you'll see a lot of fences and a lot of pillars and balconies and things like that. And you also have some friezes as well at the top of buildings, having the little like more delicate versions of a frieze and not being so over the top as they were in the Victorian times. And you also see some of the friezes down the building as well, but they'd be more plain, sort of just a little line of a different type of material, just to show you give some contrast and a bit of detail to the building. They also might have some moulding on the side of the building as well, just to say when the house was built or who lived in the house beforehand and stuff like that. So there was a few little details as well. The insides of Edwardian buildings were also, and a typical home anyway, would be more pared down and would be a lot brighter as well. They didn't have the heavy dark wallpapering, and also because electricity was more available as well, and obviously we've got bigger windows, so we can let in a lot more light. They'd obviously still have fireplaces and places for servants to live as well, but in a general house they would kind of have some electric lights or gas lights about. The wallpapering would be like pastely colours, but not as light as the Georgian era, so it's kind of halfway between. They wouldn't have a lot of pattern on it. They would also have a few decorative items, but not as many as the Victorian ones either, because they didn't have as much need to show off all that sort of thing. But they still had some things like plates and stuff on the wall, and some like odd little bits of trinkets here and there, and sort of more family rooms, as the family was kind of less split up. In this house here that I'm building at the moment, we've got a little school at the top, because this is a more wealthy family, so they would have a little nursery area and a schooling area, so they could teach their children from home. And they also have things like a big piano and stuff, so they could have a bit more entertainment at home as well. It was run for women, by women, which was very progressive at the time. In 1904, number plates were issued for anyone who was lucky enough to have a car and was only allowed to drive 20 miles an hour, which was a slight increase from last time we had a speed limit check. In 1905 was the first suffragette protest. We also had the foundation of the British Red Cross as well, and the first ever aspirin pill was sold as well, so everyone could finally cure their headaches. In 1906, Vauxhall Bridge in London was first opened, and also along with the Piccadilly line as well, so all the shoppers could finally get to the shops. And the free school meals were introduced to make sure that every child had a proper balance in their diet, especially for the poorer families who couldn't get the daily nutrients that they needed. In 1907, the Old Bailey was first founded or opened, I don't know what the correct word was, and the National Library opened as well. In 1908 was the first Ideal Home exhibition. If you ever seen any posters around London, it is the coolest, well, not the coolest, but the happening. That makes me sound so odd. It's a home show where people supposedly look at the trends, and it's clearly been working its magic all the way back from 1908. In 1909, the pension system came into force and is now a mandatory thing everyone has to pay into. Selfridges was open, so you could go get your Gucci slides. The Science Museum was open as well and made access to the public. There was the first Boy Scout rally as well, and the first Woolworths was open, and if you're a person of a certain age, you will have no idea what Woolworths is, and that is your loss. So it was a great shop full of everything you ever needed. In 1910, the Girl Guides was founded, and licenses for cinemas came in as well, so you could be a proper cinema. And in 1911, Titanic was launched from Liverpool, and the first ever Camden Town post-impressionist art group was formed as well. So they were picking up on the trends from the continent. And in 1912, the British polar explorer Scott and his team reached the South Pole. There was also a coal strike at this time, and obviously later on minimum wage was brought in for miners to stop the coal strike. The Titanic sank in this year as well on her maiden voyage, and the Blackpool illuminations started to become a tradition. And if you've not heard or seen Blackpool illuminations, every year they put on a big light show for everyone to go look at in the Christmas time or a bit earlier, and it has a theme each year, and you can go along, and it's all along the seafront. And the company who produced Lucozade produced their first ever Lucozade, so I didn't even know they were going that long, so that is quite a feat. And in 1913, it was the first ever umbrella show, and it's been going ever since as well. I did my own choice umbrella show, and Emily Davison was killed at the races at the King. I think it's the King's race. Sadly died at that, but obviously helped towards the protest and the movement. And in 1914, at the end of this era, was obviously the start of World War One, as Germany declared war on Austria, and all that fun shenanigans carried on. So I will leave you with the final furnishings of this posh Edwardian house, and you'll get to see the walkthroughs and stuff a bit later, and I will see you for the end of the war and the 1920s in the next one. Bye.